Hello, I'm Andrew Schaap and welcome to Visions of Representation, a series of interviews with scholars in democratic theory that we've recorded as part of the Horizon-funded Redirect project. In these interviews, world-leading experts in democratic theory discuss their ideas about the shifting dynamics and practices of representation within contemporary political life. In this interview, I caught up with Prof Simone Chambers at the American Political Science Association annual meeting in Vancouver in September 2025. I began by asking Professor Chambers to explain how she came to write her paper about deliberative democracy and the digital public sphere.
The paper actually is connected to an earlier paper that I wrote. Actually, I co-authored it with Jeffrey Kopstein. It's called Wrecking the Public Sphere. And the argument there was in response to what we saw as this kind of panic about algorithms. And it came out of really the reaction to the 2016 election and the development between like 2016 and 2018, 2019, this argument that the algorithms are leading us, astray. They are putting people down rabbit holes. They are creating extremism. They are creating polarization. And so it's the technology that is causing the pathologies in the internet. So I don't deny, of course, that there are a lot of pathologies in the internet, and it's getting worse and worse. But the argument that we wanted to make there was that it was actually political actors who were intentionally trying to undermine the public sphere, and not just the algorithms. And my original argument actually was entirely inspired by Habermas, because Habermas's democratic theory says the public sphere is really important. And one of the arguments we were making is that many authoritarians or quasi-authoritarians, they have no problems with elections. They actually quite like elections, but they have a lot of problem with an active, rational, critical public sphere. And so that these authoritarian actors were actually targeting the public sphere, not elections, to undermine democracy. And so we wanted to frame it as a political problem as opposed to a technocratic or technical problem. So that's one of the reasons why the piece about Habermas is quite short, and there's a lot of arguments behind it that maybe weren't brought up. And it seemed to me that Habermas's diagnosis was also leaning towards the claim that it's the technocracy that was causing the pathologies. And so, again, I don't deny that there are a lot of pathologies, but one of the things that you see, for example, in the 2020 election, that the entity that was most responsible for misinformation was Fox News. Right? So not of course, Fox News was then spread and shared on the internet, but it was it wasn't Meta that was, it was really Fox News. So the public sphere, I think, in my work, and really very much inspired by Habermas, it has three functions. So the first function is really just, it could be called an epistemic function, but it's information. People have to have information in order to be able to make judgments in their voting, in their opinions, in their preferences. So the public sphere is where you get the circulation of information. The second function is that it has a kind of accountability or critical function. So that means that the public sphere can hold representatives account, so through criticism, through making transparent some of the, say, egregious actions of representatives, of demanding an explanation and a justification for various types of actions. And so this is an accountability mechanism in which the press, of course, is very important, but also the circulation of information. And then the third, of course, is a responsiveness view, and that is that voting is not the only mechanism of responsiveness. So, of course, elected officials are voted by constituencies, and they have to respond to the interests of constituencies. But part of that, they don't just intuit what their constituency wants from just the bare vote, right? They get it from listening to reports and news and having a kind of feedback loop of information where ideally the kind of problems and issues of the civil society bubble up and are articulated in social movements, in the press, in different ways of articulation in the public sphere, and then representatives respond to them. So these three functions: information, accountability, and responsiveness. And you can't really have a functioning democracy. You can have elections, But you can't really have a functioning democracy unless you have these three functions being fulfilled by the public sphere. And it's precisely these three functions that I think authoritarians, even elected authoritarians, are trying to undermine, because they particularly don't like being called to account. They don't like criticism. There's this idea that opposition is, to be reduced. They are responsive to their base, but they don't want to be responsive to all the different kinds of claims. And they really thrive on misinformation. But one of the things that I really stress is that misinformation is quite asymmetrically distributed in our public spheres. And that's because of a kind of political targeting of certain elites to certain groups. So the public sphere never produces consensus or never produces agreement. But what it should do is that, particularly in really important issues, that we all kind of know the basic facts and that we can contribute to a general discussion, an argument, so that we know what each others are thinking and what the different positions are. And so the argument of fragmentation is that we all are going into our little echo chambers. We don't hear what other people are saying. We think our opinions are everybody's opinions. And so all three functions of the public sphere are undermined by fragmentation. And many people think that the digital communication space, particularly social media, is just conducive to this kind of fragmentation and the undermining of the public sphere in general. It is true that if fragmentation is taking place, it's very bad for democracy. But there are two questions. One is, what's actually causing the fragmentation? And also, like, how bad is it or how widespread is it? And I think we're learning we're getting a lot of empirical evidence that, first of all, fragmentation is not quite as widespread as we thought. So that people, it's not the case, there's really good empirical evidence that there's not the case that people in general are in echo chambers. It turns out that most people have a very porous information environment. It's really hard to hide from news and to hide from information in our world. So people aren't really in echo chambers, A, and B, you're more likely to be in an echo chamber the more extreme and right-wing is your opinion. And so what it appears to be the case is that it's your opinions that are causing you to choose to insulate your information environment, not that information itself is like hiding or causing you. So the problem is it's the polarization, particularly in the American public sphere, that's leading people, particularly on the right, to try to get reinforcement and to escape into, if you will, these bubbles and these echo chambers. Because you will see, if you compare the American public sphere, where there's much more polarization than, say, in Germany, there is less fragmentation in the German public sphere than you do in the American public sphere, which leads to the conclusion that it's the political context that's causing it, not the technology that's causing it. And I mean, it's still a problem, but the other issue, the asymmetry, that it's not everybody who uses the internet, it's not everybody who's on social media who is equally in an echo chamber. It's much more, as I say, on the right than on the center and on the left, which is also evidence that it's really politically caused and not technologically caused. So it says, I agree with Habermas that fragmentation is bad. I disagree that the cause is technology. And I also think that we should recognize the asymmetry. It's not everybody who uses the internet that finds himself in an echo chamber, unable to kind of talk about the same things. So Habermas is right. There is a tendency of privatization where, one of the things that people thought was going to be great about social media and the digital public sphere is that anybody can, be a somebody. And it is true, we have this kind of influencers culture where anybody in principle, although it turns out it's pretty hard to make it to the top and get your whatever million followers. But in politics, there are people, actually the tragic, assassination of Kirk, he was an influencer who just, was able to kind of rise to the top and have a lot of followers without having any political position. But it is also true that the vast, vast, vast majority of people who are on social media particularly Facebook, are consumers and not producers. Twitter, or what's now X, is actually a very small, like really, and Twitter is full of activists, people who are it's got a lot of journalists, but people who are very interested in politics, and ordinary citizens, they're not on Twitter, and they don't really follow Twitter. I mean, some of them followed Trump when he was on Twitter, but there are millions, millions, millions more people on Facebook, and most of them are just consumers. So, so although there is a problem of gatekeeping on the in the digital public sphere, I just don't think it's that much of a problem that it's just everybody is able to become an influencer. Because it's still true that somebody like Donald Trump, because of his position of power, has a huge advantage in his digital footprint in the public sphere. And it's also true that traditional media sources, from the New York Times to also Fox News, they have also a huge footprint. A bigger footprint in political news than just random individuals. So I guess I think it's an interesting observation that we're now becoming all potential authors. And I do think as a social and cultural phenomenon, this idea of influencers, for example, when people study young women and the way in which they're influenced by the internet, these are very serious social and cultural problems. But in political communication, I think it's less of a problem because I think it still is certain elite people with power who have, they're individuals who, sometimes they're private individuals like Elon Musk, but it's not everybody out there. It's these individuals who have who have this huge, communicative footprint, and they have an agenda. They have political agendas, and again, it's really not the technology. Maybe to the extent that their messages can go viral in a way that they couldn't have maybe 20 years ago, but it is a political agenda to use the internet as a tool for a political end. And I think that's very clear with Musk. He bought Twitter, made it X, and he's using it for the technology for very clear political ends. So it's pretty hard to be optimistic as a citizen of the United States right now in the public about the kind of level of debate and political communication. However, when you do look at survey data and you do look at polls, it turns out that across the political spectrum on the right and the left, people are very nervous and upset about the idea that reliable information is hard to get. So they're very worried about truth, about knowing what's going on, about sources of information. And so that makes me think that there is a kind of way of leveraging that general commitment to truth. So it's not the case that we are in a post-truth world where ordinary citizens are saying, oh, no, there's no truth. It's like, your opinion, most of them actually say, no, there are facts, and it would be terrible if we can't have access to the facts. So part of me thinks that can be leveraged in a way to try to improve things. But I do think there was a lot of misinformation in the last election, and I think that the level of kind of civility and political standards of speech in some of the things that Trump says, it still surprises me that his base, or even all the millions of people who aren't even his base but voted for him, appear to say, well, he's just being honest, or he's just being... So that is a very worrying deterioration of the public sphere. I never like to be pessimistic. I'm always a very optimistic theorist. I do think that ordinary citizens have more kind of intuitive grasp of some basics than people think. And I do think that most citizens think that we should be actually dealing in facts and truth. But how to leverage that into improving our public sphere right now, I don't know. I do think, though, that the public sphere is a place where, right now we have to try to unelect people who are trying to wreck the public sphere. who do not see it as an essential part of democracy, who think democracy is just getting them to vote, and I can get them to vote in any way. I can use any information. I can use any communicative strategy or tactic to get them to vote for me, and now I'm elected democratically. Versus the idea that, no, elections are only as good as the kind of conversation and justification and reason-giving that precedes them. And so we need to get back to representatives who have that view of democracy, which sees the public sphere and reasonable argument and pluralistic debate as an essential defining feature of democracy. So when that happens, I don't know, it's the next election.